Hello, Prime Minister. Thank you for this opportunity for me to present to you our Wampum Belt proposal. The overarching structure of the Wampum Belt is the bridge where the industrialized pillar on the left connects to the mountain on the right by water and people. Any treaty made between Canadian and Indigenous legal traditions must hold both value systems valid and equal, which is what the bridge symbolism aims to represent. A holistic approach, deriving from multiple worldviews, is more representative of the world today. The left structure is a basic construction pillar. It built Canadian skyscrapers and infrastructure, which is why it represents Canadian society. The right structure is a mountain range and water. Indigenous peoples have a direct relationship with the land and water, embodied in the languages, ceremonies, family relationships, and worldview. Protecting and maintaining sacred places, such as salmon spawning grounds, freshwater springs, food and medicine gathering areas, ceremonial spaces, and burial grounds, carries a responsibility to future generations. In the center of the Wampum Belt, the moon is represented by the crescent. Both Indigenous and Eurocentric cultures refer to the moon as governing over women. Indigenous legal traditions had equitable societies where women were respected and in positions of power. It is said that woman was used by the Creator to cast the light of knowledge on man, just as the moon casts light on the earth. The Canadian government has declared the violence against Indigenous women as a national human rights crisis, placing the moon at the center of the Wampum Belt. Signifies the importance of protecting and empowering Indigenous women in Canada. Water, which is represented by wavy lines in the Wampum Belt, is an important actor of natural law. Indigenous waterways have been entangled in colonial capitalist resource exploitation on a global scale. This includes decades of poisoning from the pulp and paper industry in the Anishinaabe community of Grassy Narrows. Recently, because of mining activity at the De Beers Victor mine and initial exploratory drilling for the Ring of Fire, mercury and methylmercury are on the rise in the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers. There is nothing more important than clean water, especially now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, at any given time, there are drinking water advisories in dozens of First Nations communities across Canada. The lack of clean, safe drinking water in First Nations is one of the greatest violations of the UN-recognized human rights to water and sanitation. To properly redress the water crisis, the decolonization of water must occur through an Indigenous-focused research method called reciprocal learning. Reciprocal learning is a community-based research technique where government workers would be required to engage with Indigenous communities to access water sources. Thus, decisions will be made in tandem with the Indigenous communities, allowing for collaborative policymaking. Each Indigenous community will be empowered to individually investigate, test, and manage the conditions of their water source through the outcomes of reciprocal learning. This would allow for the creation of specific and sustainable solutions to address their problems, rather than relying on the Canadian government for a blanket solution. Professor Tasha Beats, a respected Indigenous artist and scholar, poet, and member of Water Walkers, walked around bodies of water to bring awareness to the problems of water pollution and environmental degradation. In their media release, it states water is a unifying force that brings people together because what happens to the water happens to us all. The movement also generates the opportunity for active truth and reconciliation, not just from non-Indigenous people, but for all people to reconcile our negligence and improve our relationships with the waters, lands, and all of creation. This is represented in the Wampum Belt with the image of water flowing on both sides. Our firm also took inspiration from the 1613 two-roll Wampum belt of the 5 Iroquois nations of the Haudenosaunee. Right here, you see 2 rows of purple beads parallel set on a white background. The rows represent the course of 2 vessels, a Haudenosaunee canoe and a European ship traveling parallel together, each one having their respective nation's laws and customs, but never crossing. The belt symbolizes that neither group will force their laws, traditions, customs, or language on each other, but will coexist peacefully. A nation-to-nation relationship. We believe that the parallel lines is to reaffirm nation-to-nation relationship between the indigenous people and the crown. The foundation that was supposed to be established in Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara Falls of 1764. This symbol acknowledges the impact of colonization and resilience of generations of indigenous people seeking justice to ensure the survival of their cultures, their languages, and their way of life, which is the core of realizing new nation-to-nation, government-to-government, Inuit to crown relationships. Our history tells us, despite the 1763 Royal Proclamation, when it came time for Confederation in 1864 in Charlottetown, Indigenous people were not present. The absence has far-reaching and devastating implications to the current state of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships. This is the time to correct this mistake. After the Confederation, the policy of the Canadian government was one of assimilation and not partnership. In short, denial of the original agreement, and this denial continues to be enforced in government policies and laws, which is evident in the positions argued by government lawyers in court. It is normal not to consider the rights and realities of the Indigenous people. Erasure of their identity was done by forcing them into residential schools, making it illegal to practice their culture and ceremonies. The enactment of the Indian Act is the legal weapon they use to propagate this policy, and unfortunately, it still governs the relationships to this day. In the original Wampum Belt, you see the Indigenous and non-Indigenous person standing side by side, holding hands as equals. But after Confederation, the Indigenous people, rather being citizens or members of their own nation, they have been redefined and reduced as being wards of the state. Through the Indian Act, some 80 nations were divided into small federal administrative groups known as bands and some 3,000 reserves. As per Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action 45, we need to deconstruct the colonial reality and get back to relationships as symbolized by the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt 1764. So, how do we do this? For us, by confronting the reality of our history. But, beyond the truth-telling and the healing, we need to transform the patterns of our relations going forward with new types of agreements and constructive arrangements with the Indigenous people. Obviously, the Indian Act needs to be dismantled, and legislations that has rooted in colonialism needs to be rescinded. We need to provide and create laws and policies that recognizes Indigenous governments and lands. There is much more dialogue now between Canadians about reconciliation, which of course is very important and necessary, but recognition needs to occur before reconciliation can have real and true meaning in lives and relationships. The laws that we now have, especially those governing land and resource decision-making, do not take into consideration Indigenous titles and rights. It's not good enough to tell Indigenous people, let's reconcile, while they need to have their rights granted through expensive court proceedings and lengthy negotiations. This is not reconciliation. Recognition of Indigenous rights and land rights is the foundation of this new relationship. This symbol is to proclaim and inform that we will decolonize the federal laws policies, and operational practices to ensure that Canada's relationship with the Indigenous people is being rooted in the recognition of rights. In nation-to-nation relationship, the idea of self-determination is vital for the Indigenous people. Indigenous people set the direction of their own future with self-governing institution to serve and meet the needs of their citizens. Our laws need to be a combination of Indigenous law, provincial and federal law. Canada will be a multi-level governance where provincial, federal, territorial, and now emerging Indigenous governments share power and decision-making between and among themselves. This will then be true progress for both Indigenous and Canada as a whole. Our young people today will grow up experiencing a Canada with transformed Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships. Immigrants entering the country will also have appreciation for the status of the Indigenous people in Canada. This is to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action number 94, with the Government of Canada replacing the oath of citizenship with the following. I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including treaties with Indigenous peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. The symbolism of our proposed Wampum Belt. Respect for natural law, gender and empowerment, and equality can be put into practice through equitable water policies and political restructuring, an evolved constitutional framework that empowers Indigenous communities. The Canadian government must take responsibility to rectify its colonialist legacy and achieve equality and Indigenous autonomy. Canada can then be a more diverse, peaceful, democratic, respectful, and cohesive nation that we can all be proud of. Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister, for your attention. Have a great day.